sometimes we kind of turn around and we think, what on earth was going on there? But Jesus was led out into the wilderness and he experienced temptations. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, pride of life. He experienced temptation number 1, where he was fasting for 40 days. And the temptation came along, where make the bread out of the rocks. Prove yourself like that. And he said, I'm really hungry. I could do that for myself, but chose not to. Why? Because fasting had produced a determination with him not to indulge the flesh. The next thing that came along was he said, shown all the kingdoms of the world. He said, I'll give all of these to you if you bow down and worship. In other words, if you break your own law, if you compromise your integrity, I'll give you everything that you have come to earth for. In other words, everything you desired. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do that. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. In other words, I will obtain all of these things God's way, not my way, or the wise way, or the swift way, or the clever way. I'm not going to compromise my integrity in order to get what I want. And then was the other one, which he took him to a high place, and he said, just prove yourself to everybody. You jump off here, the angels will look after you, and they would have done. And Jesus said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to prove myself to people that way. I'll prove to myself to people a different way. I will prove myself to people by sacrifice, not by glorifying myself. And so we have this process by which Jesus is offered the 3 temptations, which is all the devil has: lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, the pride of life. And he's offered these in a way which could have tempted God, but God was not tempted. He was not tempted because he had developed a resilience, because he had fasted. It's interesting that we don't fast in our nation. We don't really fast things anymore. You see, why does fasting produce resilience? Why does fasting produce these things? Well, one of the things that it does is it tells us how to avoid getting what we want by denial. Now, why would that be a good thing? Our culture tells you, get what you want. If it feels good, do it. Just taste it. We come to church and we expect to get what we want. How could God possibly have purpose in denial? And yet we learn through fasting that if we deny ourselves some of the pleasures that would strip us of meaning or indulge us to the point of stripping away from our dependency on God, if we deny ourselves, we work into a discipline in our life so that when temptation comes along, we're able to resist it. So, for example, if we are careful with our sex and we do not indulge ourselves in temptations that way, but we fast certain things and we do not allow our eyes to see certain things, or we do not allow certain programs on TV, or we do not allow these things, and we fast things which we know are not good for us, when temptation actually comes away, we see it for what it is and we have the power to avoid it and resist it. See, the Bible never tells us that God will take away temptation. Do you know that? You can't pray for temptation not to come. It doesn't work. You can't pray for not to be tempted. You can say to the Lord, Lord, help me to be delivered from evil. But you cannot pray, deliver me from temptation. And the reason you don't pray, deliver me from temptation, is because temptation is going to come. It is part of ordinary life, and it's part of some of the tools that God ends up using to help you to grow and to develop and to become more like Christ. Because Christ went through temptations. And so we have to go through temptations, but we have lost sense of this whole thing of fasting. See, fasting also does an interesting thing. It produces an expectation of goodness and God's plan, which is counterproductive to our circumstances. In other words, our circumstances would tell us that we need this, we need that, or otherwise. Paul's circumstances would tell him that he needs to be free, he needs to be able to travel, he needs to be able to go somewhere else. So in Philippi, when they were looking at Paul and they were thinking, well, how can he be in the ministry and everything else, and he was trying to encourage them, the temptation for Paul would be, I need this, this, and this, and this in order to get my circumstances sorted out so that I can then go and preach the gospel. That was his temptation. But Paul, through fasting, knew that he had to trust God and deny himself sometimes his own wisdom, sometimes his own wants and desires for the sake of the gospel. And so Paul was able to resist the temptation to compromise himself and compromise his message because he had fasted. So it's one of the effects of fasting. And I think we need to recapture that a little bit in our Christian lives. That's a popular message, isn't it? Look, you're all really excited by that. Boy, how exciting, Gareth. Let's fast. Let's fast television. Sounds like a good idea, kids, doesn't it? Let's fast food. Well, that's actually a pretty good idea. Yeah, long term maybe. But there's something in this fasting thing. There's something in this which is fasting produces a resilience which recognizes a greater purpose despite the circumstances we find ourselves in. Fasting produces a resilience within us that recognizes a greater purpose despite the situation we find ourselves in. There can be bad situations, but we've got a resilience that we know God has a plan and purpose even in loss, even in lack, even in where we don't have enough, even when we don't have what we need. That's why fasting food for 40 days, and that's what it was producing in Christ, a dependency on God. So he can turn around to Satan when Satan says, make this stuff into bread, and say, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. And it's interesting that the way Jesus replied is from the word that was within him. And it tells you this: you cannot resist temptation using somebody else's faith. You cannot resist temptation using somebody else's commitment to God. You cannot resist temptation using your pastor. You cannot resist temptation using your pastor as an excuse or as a source of wisdom. You have to go to the word yourself. You have to be dependent on Christ yourself. You have to be dependent on the words of Jesus yourself. You cannot resist it without that. You can't. And one of the interesting effects of that is the way that we work out our ministry life. And I'm going to lead into the next sermon, and I'm going to kind of end with this. It's interesting sometimes that, and I'm kind of learning this because I'm a little pastor. I'm learning. Okay, I'm like James. We're just kind of little babies, aren't we? Really screaming, "Wow!" Not quite sure what God's doing in our lives. But it's interesting that people will come up to me sometimes. And I'm sure some of you are here, but I'm thinking of you right now because I can't remember it. But people come up to me sometimes and they'll say, why aren't we doing this? Gareth, you're a pastor in the church. You sort out the church. Why aren't we doing this in our town? And I'll say, we haven't got the money. And you'll say to me, what kind of faith is that? And I don't say to you, your faith's in me, not God. You're trying to use my faith as an excuse for what God isn't doing in the town. You're trying to use my faith as an excuse for not believing yourself. You're trying to build a ministry on what you think I'm capable of producing by my faith in God. That's why you come up to me and you say, why isn't this happening? And when I say there isn't the money, you say, that's not faith, you should believe there's more money. Yes, I should. I do. But what's interesting is, I have put faith in all sorts of things, and my life has been transformed and is continuing to change, and I am on a journey of faith, and I do make mistakes, and I recognize that. But my faith is accountable to Christ and Christ alone, and not to you, unfortunately. Sorry. That produces two positive factors, okay? One positive factor, it means I'm still able to speak into your life, because if my faith was dependent on your expectations and everything else, then I would have to G you up in order to get more faith. I can't do that. The other thing that it does is it produces a dependency on God, which means I'm able to be sensitive to God and his leading and his moving rather than sensitive to your influence, which is a good thing. Okay? Doesn't mean we won't listen, don't mean we don't listen to people, and we do. And I have a spirit that just desperately tries to help people and look after people, and that's just the way I work. I'm not like one of these leaders that's just going to trailblaze through and destroy everything in their path. That just doesn't work with me. I try and get people to follow.